Malachi's Cove, read by Eve Karpf. On the northern coast of Cornwall, between Tintagel and Bossiney, down on the very margin of the sea, there lived not long since an old man who got his living by saving seaweed from the waves and selling it for manure. The cliffs there are bold and fine, and the sea beats in upon them from the north with a grand violence. I doubt whether it be not the finest morsel of cliff scenery in England, though it is beaten by many portions of the west coast of Ireland, and perhaps also by spots in Wales and Scotland. Cliffs should be nearly precipitous. They should be broken in their outlines, and should barely admit here and there of an insecure passage from their summit to the sand at their feet. The sea should come, if not up to them, at least very near to them, and then, above all things, the water below them should be blue, and not of that dead leaden colour which is so familiar to us in England. At Tintagel, all these requisites are there, except that bright blue colour which is so lovely. But the cliffs themselves are bold and well broken, and the margin of sand at high water is very narrow, so narrow that at spring tides there is barely a footing there. Close upon this margin was the cottage or hovel of Malachi Trengloss, the old man of whom I have spoken. But Malachi, or Old Gloss, as he was commonly called by the people around him, had not built his house absolutely upon the sand. There was a fissure in the rock so great that at the top it formed a narrow ravine, and so complete from the summit to the base that it afforded an opening for a steep and rugged track from the top of the rock to the bottom. This fissure was so wide at the bottom that it had afforded space for Trengloss to fix his habitation on a foundation of rock, and here he had lived for many years. It was told of him that in the early days of his trade he had always carried the weed in a basket on his back to the top, but latterly he had been possessed of a donkey which had been trained to go up and down the steep track with a single pannier over his loins, for the rocks would not admit of panniers hanging by his side. And for this assistant he had built a shed adjoining his own, and almost as large as that in which he himself resided. But as years went on, Old Gloss procured other assistance than that of the donkey, or, as I should rather say, Providence supplied him with other help. And indeed, had it not been so, the old man must have given up his cabin and his independence, and gone into the workhouse at Camelford. For rheumatism had afflicted him, old age had bowed him till he was nearly double, and by degrees he became unable to attend the donkey on its upward passage to the world above, or even to assist in rescuing the coveted weed from the waves. At the time to which our story refers, Trengloss had not been up the cliff for 12 months, and for the last 6 months he had done nothing towards the furtherance of his trade, except to take the money and keep it, if any of it was kept, and occasionally to shake down a bundle of fodder for the donkey. The real work of the business was done altogether by Mahala Trengloss, his granddaughter. Mally Trengloss was known to all the farmers round the coast and to all the small tradespeople in Camelford. She was a wild-looking, almost unearthly creature, with wild, flowing, black, uncombed hair, small in stature, with small hands and bright black eyes. But people said that she was very strong, and the children around declared that she worked day and night and knew nothing of fatigue. As to her age, there were many doubts. Some said she was 10, and others 5 and 20. But the reader may be allowed to know that at this time she had in truth passed her 20th birthday. The old people spoke well of Mally because she was so good to her grandfather, and it was said of her that though she carried to him a little gin and tobacco almost daily, she bought nothing for herself. And as to the gin, no one who looked at her would accuse her of meddling with that. But she had no friends, and but few acquaintances among people of her own age. They said that she was fierce and ill-natured, that she had not a good word for anyone, and that she was, complete at all points, a thorough little vixen. The young men did not care for her, for as regarded dress, all days were alike with her. She never made herself smart on Sundays. She was generally without stockings, and seemed to care not at all to exercise any of those feminine attractions which might have been hers had she studied to attain them. All days were the same to her in regard to dress, and indeed, till lately, all days had, I fear, been the same to her in other respects. Old Malachi had never been seen inside a place of worship since he had taken to live under the cliff. But within the last 2 years, Mally had submitted herself to the teaching of the clergyman at Tintagel, and had appeared at church on Sundays, if not absolutely without punctuality, at any rate so often that no one who knew the peculiarity of her residence was disposed to quarrel with her on that subject. But she made no difference in her dress on these occasions. She took her place on a low stone seat just inside the church door, clothed as usual in her thick red serge petticoat and loose brown serge jacket, such being the apparel which she had found to be best adapted for her hard and perilous work among the waters. She had pleaded to the clergyman, when he attacked her on the subject of church attendance with vigour, that she had got no church-going clothes. He had explained to her that she would be received there without distinction to her clothing. Mally had taken him at his word, and had gone, with a courage which certainly deserved admiration, though I doubt whether there was not mingled with it an obstinacy which was less admirable. For people said that old Gloss was rich, and that Mally might have proper clothes if she chose to buy them. Mr. Polwarth, the clergyman, who, as the old man could not come to him, went down the rocks to the old man, did make some hint on the matter in Mally's absence. But old Gloss, who had been patient with him on other matters, turned upon him so angrily when he made an allusion to money that Mr. Polwarth found himself obliged to give that matter up, and Mally continued to sit upon the stone bench in her short serge petticoat, with her long hair streaming down her face. She did so far sacrifice to decency as on such occasions to tie up her black hair with an old shoestring. So tied it would remain through the Monday and Tuesday, but by Wednesday afternoon Mally's hair had generally managed to escape. As to Mally's indefatigable industry, there could be no manner of doubt, for the quantity of seaweed which she and the donkey amassed between them was very surprising. Old Gloss, it was declared, had never collected half what Mally gathered together. But then the article was becoming cheaper, and it was necessary that the exertion should be greater. So Mally and the donkey toiled and toiled, and the seaweed came up in heaps, which surprised those who looked at her little hands and light form. Was there not someone who helped her at nights? Some fairy or demon or the like? Mally was so snappish in her answers to people that she had no right to be surprised if ill-natured things were said of her. No one ever heard Mally Trengloss complain of her work, but about this time she was heard to make great and loud complaints of the treatment she received from some of her neighbours. It was known that she went with her plaints to Mr. Polwarth, and when he could not help her, or did not give her such instant help as she needed, she went, oh, so foolishly, to the office of a certain attorney at Camelford, who was not likely to prove himself a better friend than Mr. Polwarth. Now the nature of her injury was as follows. The place in which she collected her seaweed was a little cove. The people had come to call it Malachi's Cove from the name of the old man who lived there, which was so formed that the margin of the sea therein could only be reached by the passage from the top down to Trengloss's hut. The breadth of the cove, when the sea was out, might perhaps be 200 yards, and on each side the rocks ran out in such a way that both from north and south the domain of Trengloss was guarded from intruders. And this locality had been well chosen for its intended purpose. There was a rush of the sea into the cover, which carried their large, drifting masses of seaweed, leaving them among the rocks when the tide was out. During the equinoctial winds of the spring and autumn, the supply would never fail, and even when the sea was calm, the long, soft, salt-bedewed, trailing masses of the weed could be gathered there when they could not be found elsewhere for miles along the coast. The task of getting the weed from the breakers was often difficult and dangerous, so difficult that much of it was left to be carried away by the next incoming tide. Mally doubtless did not gather half the crop that was there at her feet. What was taken by the returning waves she did not regret. But when interlopers came upon her cove and gathered her wealth, her grandfather's wealth, beneath her eyes, then her heart was broken.